Welcome everyone to Rocks for Jocks. This podcast is intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. This channel is not intended to provide any financial advice, medical advice, or life advice. Now welcome to the show. So I wrote most of this episode on Thursday, September 12th, the date that the first private spacewalk took place. A spacewalk is going to be when someone exposes themselves to outer space and is completely reliant on a spacesuit for environmental support. The technical term for this is extravehicular activity, often abbreviated to EVA. Not really relevant, but that was just a term I saw thrown around on a lot of news websites when they were talking about this. The reason today was so important is that it's the first time someone paid for themselves to do a spacewalk for fun. Part of our country's new space tourism industry that we seem to be developing. I've got some thoughts on this, some good, some bad, some just surprising things that I learned while watching those recordings on that Thursday. My disclosure up front is that this episode will be pretty much entirely opinion-based, and I'm going to kind of take my time going through a few of the pros and cons of space tourism from my perspective. I'm going to start with saying that events like privately funded space tourism have the potential for a bunch of really good impacts on our country and the world. Mainly, it's that privately funded companies providing tourist expeditions often result in more innovations, technologically and strategy-wise, all of that good stuff. This was seen really clearly on September 12th by the spacesuits that the astronauts used. When they left the capsule, the spacesuits that they were wearing, at least from the outside, looked a lot sleeker and easier to maneuver than typical NASA suits that they've used in the past. That important innovation occurs in some more subtle ways as well. The vehicles themselves, for example, the rockets, air filtration technology, communications products, all of these have been and will continue to be iterated on and improved, especially in cases where private companies and privately funded space travel provide more incentive to make these safer and more efficient. I guess the safer part is a little bit hypothetical, as there's always a chance that some companies decide making space travel cheaper is more important than the passenger's safety. But for the sake of the argument, I'm going to assume that safety regulations are firmly in place. The second reason why privately funded space missions have so much potential for good is simply for the publicity it brings to outer space, science, and engineering. Every event like this generates dozens of newspaper headlines all across the world. The buzz created by these events, hopefully, eventually trickles down into young people, getting them interested in space and space science and engineering. Maybe some more students sign up for science and engineering classes. Maybe some more students produce science projects or research or a podcast to teach others about what they know. Maybe more people become engineers and create products for others to use. Or maybe people just care more about scientific research in general and either donate to research programs or museums, or maybe they vote in politicians who direct more government fundings towards projects that advance society. Overall, I think pretty much all publicity around science, causing people to learn just a little bit more, is going to be a good thing. Now on to the not so good stuff. From an environmental perspective, sending people in machinery into space is incredibly taxing on the environment, especially in terms of emissions. Rockets are notorious to contributing towards greenhouse gas emissions on their way to break through the atmosphere and beyond into Earth's orbit. Broadly speaking, I'd say myself and many others who prioritize the environment are perfectly fine with this trade-off, as most missions by NASA, for example, do a great job of pushing forward science and technology by leaps and bounds, so much so that it definitely makes the emissions worth it. Alternatively, sending people and resources up into space for fun doesn't really provide any benefit. Even if they're paying for themselves financially, it's kind of tough to justify the environmental cost. Theoretically, it may be true that the extra funding will eventually help companies providing space tourism to improve technology faster and therefore help publicly funded missions be cheaper in the long run. But in the short to medium term, I'm suspecting the extra missions are going to become a fairly large problem without any clear payoff. The easiest rebuttal to this is to say, hey, Alex, you dummy. The extra emissions from one extra person contribute barely anything in emissions. So why does this matter? And yeah, that's true for one person. But in a decade, if we are working with hundreds or thousands of people per year, the emissions are going to start to stack up pretty quickly. The next rebuttal I thought to that would be, hey, normal travel tourism on Earth causes emissions too. So why is space tourism a problem worth discussing if someone jetting off to Miami for spring break isn't a problem? My response to this is that it's a problem of scale. The emissions are wildly different when we're considering one additional person on a commercial plane versus one additional person being shot into outer space with rockets. According to an article by the BBC in 2022, the amount of fossil fuels burned by the space industry was about 1% of what was burned by conventional aviation. Putting this into perspective, in 2023, the world combined shot around 2,700 objects into space, while flying planes around 37 million times. And I'll make sure to put some links to these sources in the episode description. That means that humans combined had around 15,000 times as many flights as there were objects shot into space, but emissions were only 100 times higher. Essentially, what we're saying is that normal flights are going to be much less impactful to amount of fossil fuels burned than extra objects launched into space. On top of that, every additional commercial flight can fit hundreds of times more people than a single space capsule. There are, of course, a few cases where companies are exploring alternative fuels or other ways to lower emissions, and I hope that they're successful. But we should keep in mind that these projects, even those with some promising early results, aren't guaranteed to work on a large scale for a variety of business reasons. To wrap this section up, I'm going to say that a few people traveling to space for fun, compared with the whole space industry, doesn't increase emissions that much. But thousands of people doing that will eventually turn it into a decent-sized problem to things like air quality and climate change. In economics, this type of problem is referred to as a tragedy of the commons, where negative impacts from one person's actions add up when a bunch of people take those same actions and eventually become a bigger and bigger problem to the whole community. Lastly, I want to touch on something fun I learned while watching the spacewalk, which is that air being pumped into the astronauts' suits for breathing is usually 100% oxygen. On Earth, we're used to breathing in a mix of nitrogen and oxygen and a few other elements, where nitrogen and oxygen put together is a lot bigger than just a single molecule of oxygen atoms. This means that if we wanted to breathe similar amounts of oxygen in space, and we wanted to keep using that same nitrogen and oxygen mix that we're used to, the airflows become more highly pressurized, making it really hard to move around. To avoid this problem, they use 100% oxygen pumped into the suits, allowing for easier movement and less energy used. If you enjoy this episode, please subscribe wherever you are listening. If you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, give it 5 stars. It'll take 20 seconds of your day tops, but it will make my week. If you're on YouTube, give this episode a like. It actually just takes 2 seconds to do. Thank you all.